So my name is Serge Dedina. Today we'll be talking about rewilding our coast and ocean with blue carbon-based natural climate solutions.
I'm Cheryl Goddard. I'm the Executive Director with the Conservancy. I am happy to have you guys all here tonight with a filled room. Thank you for venturing out of the rain. Seems like Mother Nature loves our speaker series, comes out with the rain, blesses us with rain, the water, flushes out our water systems, obviously beneficial to our plants and animals, and will make for a spectacular wildflower season to look forward to. So look out for those flowers along the Coast to Crest Trail, and really everywhere in Southern California. It's going to be beautiful this season. I wanted to thank our Education and Outreach Committee, which consists of our board members and advisory board members, staff, as well as our interpretive rangers, our partners at the San Diego River Park Joint Powers Authority. This speaker series was born out of that committee, so I thank them for that. I thank Gabrielle Weinhausen, Karen Searcy, Kim Yanks, who is our Community Engagement Manager, who have led this series. They've coordinated, they have found fun and interesting and dynamic speakers like we have tonight with Serge Dedina. Serge is the Executive Director for WILDCOAST. Love WILDCOAST. Great partners. We actually have a planting event with them coming up this weekend. And we love them because they trust us, they support us, they fund us. So a lot of habitat restoration projects here in the city of Del Mar, along River Path Del Mar, Del Mar Heights and Gonzales Canyon, and around the lagoon. So very thankful for you, Serge, and for WILDCOAST and your team for joining us here tonight. And before Serge starts, I want to introduce Gabrielle, who will talk a little bit more about our speaker series and also specifically about the talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Also, a warm welcome to tonight's talk. I know you were excited to start right away. I could feel it, but you have to wait a few seconds. So I would like to remind you again what the Connecting Creatures, Climate and Communities series is all about. So it is designed to help people, us, appreciate and develop an appreciation for the importance of the San Dieguito River watershed and its associated wetlands. And the series seeks to guide all of us in learning about the history and geology of the watershed, the importance of tidal wetlands, the flora and fauna of the wetlands, and the interconnection between people and the environment, including management and restoration issues. So the overarching goal of the Connecting Creatures, Climate and Community series is to get all of us who are living in the communities within the San Dieguito watershed to be mindful of the human and natural connections associated with the watershed, and to think of and take pride in the watershed as our address. And by nurturing and promoting a sense of rootedness and belonging, the series hopes to inspire people to become stewards and partners in protecting this ecological jewel. And you still have to wait because you got already an introduction, but you will get an even better one. So Serge Dedina leads, as Cheryl said, the international team at WILDCOAST, which he co-founded in 2000. As a former California State Parks ocean lifeguard, Serge was elected to 2 terms as mayor of Imperial Beach, California, from 2014 to 2022. His innovative ocean conservation work has been reported on by the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, NBC News, Washington Post, BBC, NPR, Wall Street Journal, and 60 Minutes, among others. And in recognition of his successful conservation endeavors, Serge received the Surf Industries Environmental Award, San Diego Zoological Society's Conservation Medal, as well as the California Coastal Commission's Coastal Hero Award. And he was also named at UC San Diego's Muir College as a John Muir Fellow. And he was honored as Peter Benchley Hero of the Sea. Serge holds a BA in Political Science from UC San Diego, a master's degree in Geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in Geography from the University of Texas in Austin. And without further ado, Serge, please. Welcome.
Thanks. You know, this is arguably one of the most intimidating groups I've spoken to. Like, there's some true conservation legends in here. So it's an honor. And Cheryl, the San Diego River Valley Conservancy staff and board are absolutely awesome, completely mission focused. And Wild Coast is honored and just inspired to partner with people who love nature. And people ask me, oh, why didn't you go on to politics? And you know, the reality is, I like to hang out with cool people who do conservation. Like I want to get in the dirt and the sand and the mud and the waves, like with people who are super excited about having their shoes off and getting dirty, and like love talking about wildlife. Someone like Ron Swaysgood from the San Diego Zoological Society. Ron, raise your hand. True conservation. Can we give him a round of applause? Because we worked very closely with the zoo on condor reintroduction in Baja California, but Ron's going to bring back the pandas to San Diego. So he's like, yeah, yay! And one thing I love about working with people from Scripps Institution of Oceanography or the River Valley Conservancy or the San Diego Zoo is that, like, the dirtier they are, the more it's raining, the more they're hanging out, like, in the nature, the happier they are. It's really, and they love talking about animals and ecosystems. There are so many conservation nerds here. It's just awesome. So that's really exciting, and including my own staff. And if you guys want to raise your hand as a team from Wild Coast, yeah, we have a same thing. You're bonding at Wild Coast in the field. That's the idea. So tonight we're going to be talking about rewilding our coast and ocean, which, you know, I just tried to give a cool name so people would show up. But so I'm really glad you're all here. I'm just trying to start the time. And but really, just give a view. I'm not a soil scientist. I'm a geographer. I'm not a geochemist. So, you know, if you're looking for intricacies of the chemistry of carbon sequestration, I'm not that guy. If you want an overview of sort of natural climate solutions and blue carbon, the carbon sequestered by coastal ecosystems, we're going to do an undergrad lecture 101 tonight, right? Just kind of like what it's about, why it's important, and fundamentally, this is the deal. And what I want all of us to take away from, we're not going to apologize for doing conservation, right? We're here to defend the planet and all life on Earth. And more importantly, this is the most important thing we can do, right? Restoring our Earth, restoring our green and blue spaces, every inch of them, right? Not getting defensive when people who are destroying the Earth tell us that something's wrong with us when we say, hey, hold on a minute, nature is important. So it's something that saw the CEO Ryan Gellert of Patagonia give a talk last night in Laguna Beach. Same attitude, right? Like we're here, Patagonia's changed its business model to save nature, right? That was really inspiring. So anyway, I also want to point out Dwight Worden from the city of Del Mar. Give him a round of applause. Dwight's number one. So I served in government. There was no one more enthusiastic and passionate about nature than Dwight, except for Don Mosher, formerly of the Del Mar City Council, now on the Del Mar Fairgrounds Board. So that's really interesting as well. So we've got Matt from Senator Catherine Blakespear's office. Matt, raise your... Let me tell you, Catherine's the real deal as well. Catherine loves nature. She's doing a great job in Sacramento. She is doing some really cool work on the coast and ocean. And we formed a subcommittee at Sandag to get Caltrans to pick up highway litter, which they're not doing a good enough job anymore. So we're going to get them fired up to do stuff. So anyway, just a little background on myself, besides all the accolades. So I grew up in an immigrant family. My mom was bombed in London in the Blitz. My dad's family escaped the Nazi occupation of Europe, and many of his relatives were sent to death camps. So they celebrated the United States and freedom by being at the beach. My hippie parents, we lived in a van in Central America. We were hanging out on the beach my whole life. We were like the original hippie van, but this van family, but in the 1970s, right? Traveling all over Mexico, in the mangroves with indigenous villages, and it just gave me appreciation for really being outside. My parents I wasn't allowed to watch TV at home. I was supposed to be, on Saturdays, I was outside, kicked out of the house, outside. But it really gave me appreciation for living in Central America when I was a kid. Gave me appreciation for nature, but also people and nature. The fact that we can take it for granted that our national park system excluded indigenous people from it. And, we set up that way. You can't do that in Mexico. You can't do that in El Salvador. You can't do that where Ron works in South America or for most places around the world. We have to figure out how to have relationships with people to preserve nature. But I got my start in the environment. Maybe you may recognize Brian Bilbray, but he was our mayor of IB back then. I moved to IB in 1971. And Brian hated the Tijuana estuary. He hates it when I talk about this. Was planning on turning the Tijuana estuary into Marina del Rey, right? Big high-rise condos and apartment buildings. I sat in front of bulldozers trying to bulldoze the Tijuana estuary. He became famous for this. We got beat up, but we stopped him. And in 1980, Ronald Reagan helped create the Tijuana Estuary National Estuarine Research Reserve and National Wildlife Refuge. So we have someone from the we have Fish and Wildlife Service staff here. So anyway, so really happy about that, right? But I got beat up doing it, right? In 1980, it wasn't easy to be an environmentalist. It wasn't easy to be a conservationist. No one was applauding people who were saving nature back then in San Diego. It's amazing that today we have all this string of gorgeous wetlands along our coast. It's actually amazing. And I did my master's on the history of conservation of the Tijuana River Valley and estuary. And, the reality is the whole slew of legislation, starting with NEPA, CEQA, Endangered Species Act, California Coastal Act, are responsible for helping the fact that we've got these gorgeous wetlands today. That back then we were saving nature and saving wildlife. Now we know that these places are keys to preserving, helping us address climate change. But like every other young surfer in San Diego, in college, I spent my college years in Peru, in Morocco, and then a PhD in Mexico. So surfing for me was a really good way of exploring the world and being out on the edge of wilderness with people who lived with nature, right? You don't escape it with fishermen, basically fishing families. I became addicted to that, really. And it wasn't just about riding waves, although it kind of was, but it was really about just hanging out with people and talking to them about their relationship with nature. That's what I'm interested in. That's what my PhD on saving gray whales was about, the history of gray whale conservation in Mexico. But Royce, my wife and Emily spent 2 years living in gray whale lagoons in Baja California with fishing families to really understand the process of conservation. What does it mean to say, we're going to save a gray whale lagoon in Mexico? How does that work? I wrote a book about it called Saving the Gray Whale, right? And really, it's about my buddy Antonio Aguilar, who was a fisherman turned whale watching guide, talking about the fact that he approaches a whale like he does a cow, right? He was a rancher turned fisherman turned whale watching guide, right? Understanding people's relationship with animals, with ecosystems, is the key to helping us preserve those areas. And as Ron knows, and when we are out and far in the field, and many of you know, you're going to see people do things to animals you may not like. You're going to see people slaughter animals. You're going to see people shoot animals to help save sea turtles. My wife and I went out and watched people slaughter sea turtles, right? And with the guy that I founded WILDCOAST with, Dr. Wallace J. Nichols, who's written a book called Blue Mind, he was studying turtles for his PhD. I did gray whale conservation. We merged together to form WILDCOAST, and one of our big projects was working with sea turtle poachers to flip them into becoming sea turtle conservationists, right? Which we did, and sea turtles have come back from near extinction, Eastern Pacific green turtles. So it's a great success story. But the reality is, when you're doing conservation in the field, this is in Oaxaca, you get a lot of fingers pointed at you. You're not always the most popular person. We don't do conservation to be popular, but it can be very challenging. And the reality is, those tough situations in the field prepared me for being mayor of Imperial Beach. So, facing down 150 people mad about managed retreat, Don and Dwight know all about that. It's like people I've known my whole life, mad that I was going to apparently take every house at IB and turn it into a wetland restoration project. We're not really sure how that would have worked. Was really like compared to having the Minister of Tourism Development in Mexico mad at me about stopping marina projects in Baja, or having these guys in Oaxaca. When they tell you in Oaxaca, they're like, if we don't like what you do, we put you in our jail. Like, yeah, it's like, okay, guys. So I'm not going to go, at least at IB, I wasn't going to go to the jail, right? But really rewarding experience being mayor of my hometown, a place I moved to at the age of 7. I didn't run to be an environmentalist mayor because we'd saved all the open space in IB, just like Del Mar, right, is surrounded by open space. Those issues that framed the conservation debate starting 50 years ago in San Diego or more, we don't have those as much. There's different types of debates, but amazing, a whole generation of conservationists, people in public agencies, helped save some of the most amazing ecosystems in San Diego County and across the United States. Now, is that finished? No. Does Ryan and his team at the zoo need to still work on wildlife conservation and management? Absolutely. So does the Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Fish and Game or Wildlife, right? Like, it's a never-ending project. But I became mayor to help address getting IB the kinds of things that we didn't have. You guys take for granted that we don't have a grocery store in IB. We didn't have a good library. You know, we didn't have a Parks and Rec department. We didn't have a swimming pool. When I left office 8 years later, we radically transformed the city. But we did focus on coastal resiliency and adaptation. We did support Fish and Wildlife Service doing even more restoration projects around San Diego Bay. We did, of course, file a lawsuit against the U.S. government for destroying the Tijuana estuary because of billions of gallons of wastewater. That's an ongoing drama that Scott Peters and Mike Levin have been absolutely instrumental helping us address. But what I found was, you know, they say, oh, this nonprofit guy is going to, you know, what does he know about politics or running a city? But actually being a nonprofit director, working with nothing was really good experience running a city with nothing, right? So you don't have anything, social capital. It's like broing out with people in the street, right? So anyway, but my joy in life in 2000, January 1st, 2000, Wallace J. Nichols and I started WILDCOAST, the mission to conserve coastal and marine ecosystems and address climate change through natural solutions. The idea fundamentally is this about WILDCOAST: saving wild nature, saving the coast as it's meant to be. Really, it was focused, we did our PhDs in Baja. The focus was on the race to save Baja. I had discovered that Mitsubishi was going to build a giant salt harvesting facility in San Ignacio Lagoon, the last gray whale lagoon. And that was 2000, that was in 1993, I'm sorry. And before that, Baja was pretty wide open. But, you know, after the 1990s and through the 2000s, every multinational on the planet had some plan to turn beautiful, pristine places in Baja, many of them already national parks, into giant industrial facilities. So we spent years really pushing back along with a whole group of fishermen and ecotourism guides to save some of these places. But I didn't start WILDCOAST with Jay. We didn't start it to fight people. We started it to work with communities to help them save the lands that they depend on for their livelihoods, fishermen and ranchers, right? People who raise cattle, people who kill wild animals, people who make a living from the land and water with their families, but who have a vested interest in saving nature, right? I had to watch people slit the throats of goats and, you know, kill sea turtles and tell me that when I saw a bobcat, it's like, oh, did you have a rifle to shoot it, right? Like, it's a different, you have to check your ego when you do this work, right? But that's the same in the US as well as it is in Mexico, right? It's not about us, it's about supporting efforts to figure out how to save these amazing areas, whether it's San Diego Lagoon or it's or San Ignacio Lagoon. Our international team is now 30. We have offices from here in Del Mar and all the way down to southern Mexico, with offices in Ensenada, La Paz, and in Oaxaca. An amazing, dynamic, binational team. Everything we do is in English and Spanish, or Spanish and English. And we really focus on working together. Our team hopefully will be going down to the field in San Ignacio Lagoon, where some of our staff are today. But we bring our staff from Mexico up here as well to learn about conservation in the US. So it's a really fun, exciting place to be a part of. It's really great to see these kids come out of college and mission focused. They want to help save the planet and deal with and address climate change that, you know, our generations have caused. So anyway, but how do we carry out our mission? We're establishing and managing protected areas, protecting and restoring blue carbon ecosystems, and then partnering with local governments, local communities, and the private sector to carry that out. That's really the job. We don't file lawsuits in Wild Coast. We're not really an advocacy policy group. It's really about on-the-ground conservation. As part of that, we do a lot of different work. We work everywhere from California all the way down to southern Mexico, with plans to expand to Colombia and possibly Chile. We've worked in Cuba supporting coral reef protection as well. And we're a binational group constituted in U.S. and Mexico. But we're working on mangrove conservation. We actually bought more than 51,000 acres of land in Central Baja, some of the largest coastal land conservancy in North America, a lot like what Chris and Doug Tompkins did down in southern Patagonia. Chris Tompkins, if you haven't seen that work, it's a great documentary. They've set aside millions of acres in southern Patagonia. If you haven't been down to Patagonia, it looks like Colorado and Wyoming on steroids, near the ocean. We did the same thing in Central Baja. After the government had announced plans to put marinas in the middle of nowhere, the most pristine coastal desert in North America, we ended up buying up a lot of the river valleys and watersheds. So think about having a coastline from here to Laguna Beach. That's what we did, right? So really, really exciting. And then wetland conservation, ocean conservation through marine protected area management in Mexico and the United States, including coral reefs. Real big focus on sea turtle nesting beaches in Mexico. And then we're not a garbage group, but basically we got so sick of the slow pace of progress on the Tijuana River that we got a grant from Mark Benioff at Salesforce through UC Santa Barbara and NOAA, and now the San Diego Foundation to build trash booms in canyons in Tijuana. It's not even coming close to stopping the onslaught of trash, but so we filed a lawsuit in the city of IB in 2017 against the United States government, along with City of Chula Vista, State of California, City of San Diego, Port of San Diego, and Surfrider. Nothing still has been done to fix that problem. Even though Mike Levin and Scott Peters and Juan Vargas helped us get $300 million, that money hasn't been spent yet. So in the meantime, Wild Coast is building trash booms, including, Ron, you'll like this, with confiscated nets that were used to harvest totoaba, the endangered fish in the upper Gulf, and kill vaquita dolphins. We're using those nets to catch trash in Tijuana. San Diego could have used those nets in Joyas Creek, that's for sure. So, and then obviously everything we do is community partnerships, or working with groups like community-based groups like the San Diego River Valley Conservancy. I don't need to tell you guys, this is not the audience I need to convince that climate change is happening, and everyone's pointing, it's happening somewhere else. We all know it's happening all around us, right? We're seeing things that we're changing. You know, it just snowed 10 feet in the Sierras, although it wasn't maybe one of the biggest storms, but we're seeing more water in the atmosphere, more extreme events, and we're seeing it hit Central and Southern California, right, in Mexico. You know, we all know that the sea levels are rising. This is a 2017 graph from NASA, but it's amazing to see NASA pivot into the climate change arena with some amazing science. We're seeing stronger hurricanes form in Mexico and form faster. The hurricane that hammered and obliterated Acapulco just over the summer or in the fall, that hurricane, no one predicted it would happen, and no one predicted it was going to happen that quickly and just move on shore. That's because our staff were in southern Mexico in the spring measuring 90-degree temperatures and 60 feet under the ocean, right? 60 feet, 90-degree temperatures. 90% of the corals in southern Mexico bleached, right? 90%, right? So we knew this was happening. The hurricanes are forming offshore in the Gulf of Tehuantepec, the hurricane-producing belt from the eastern Pacific, and they're going ashore, right, quickly. Acapulco had gotten rid of most of its mangroves. They'd gotten rid of them. So mangroves help detain and buffer some of the communities against sea level rise, but they got rid of most of them, right? So no defense, no defenses. It was a real wake-up call for Mexico. But we've got our own atmospheric rivers. We love working with Scripps Institution of Oceanography. They're doing so much amazing science, but so much amazing applied science. That's brilliant science for helping humans understand the world better, but also to make better decisions. The atmospheric river team is really sort of highlighted and out predicting these coming, which is great. In Imperial Beach, the folks at the Center for Climate Change and Adaptation actually developed buoys offshore that helped us forecast flooding, right? That hopefully could be a prototype for something like that, ocean sort of buoys all over the world. But we know it's been happening in California. I talked to a buddy of mine who's up in Santa Cruz, runs Save the Waves, and Steamer Lane, the famous surf spot, got damaged. But this is just north of Steamer Lane last year when these hurricane-like storms are focused on the Central Coast, right, with big surf and big rain. Montecito, I was in Montecito after these floods happened and the mudslides before the pandemic. It's just astounding, right? These events are happening everywhere, whether it's wildfires in Texas or mudslides in Montecito exacerbated by drought and then caused, when you have excessive rain, right? It's slamming into the area north of Ventura. It's hitting the rich and poor in Newport and Montecito and right, Newport, crazy flooding. I was at a conference in Newport Beach. Realtors are concerned about sea level rise, right? They definitely don't like managed retreat, but they definitely want to figure out how to have a balance, right? It's been interesting having that conversation with people. They're seeing this. They just saw it in Newport and Seal Beach, right? San Clemente, the mayor, Andy Hall, who was the city manager of Imperial Beach with me, then got a job at the city of San Clemente and the cliffs started falling. So it's like, dude, you went from one disaster, the Tijuana River, to San Clemente. It's a real deal in San Clemente with the train corridor, and Catherine Blakespeare is really working on that legislatively. And I don't need to tell you what's going on in Del Mar, right? Challenging stuff. Challenging stuff. And I think what Del Mar and IB realized is that talking about managed retreat isn't really the frame that California needs to be adopting. Talking about natural climate solutions and adapting our infrastructure is where we need to focus, right? That's the pivot for many people in government and the adaptation side, whether it's Surfrider or WILDCOAST. We're like, we need to be focusing on the infrastructure. We need to be focusing on our wetlands. We need to be focusing on massive restoration and adaptation projects. But maybe getting in fights with people over their homes isn't the most effective use of our time. I'm not going to talk about anything more than that, but that's what I said that very publicly. And not every coastal manager wants to hear that, but I can guarantee you the governor and Wade Crowfoot, the resources secretary, probably were receptive to that, because focusing just on people's homes when we've got a crisis happening isn't really that effective. And whether it's in Chollas Creek, where we had also, and all these creeks in San Diego, that, let's face it, it was the rain, because I happened to be driving on the freeway when the rain started falling. But the fact is, people didn't clean up storm drains. People didn't clean up the garbage everywhere. I think we've all noticed, and you get as sick as I do, the fact that our highways are covered in garbage, including just here over San Diego River Valley. So we got some work to do. The point here is that it's happening, so we need to move more quickly. We need to be smarter, and we're going to have to do things. We're going to have to figure out our regulatory system. So the regulatory system was designed to slow things down, bad things to nature, but now we need to speed things up to help nature and help us adapt to climate change. So anyway, with that introduction, let's talk about blue carbon. This is really, it's a cool world, just like rewilding, for the carbon captured and stored in coastal and marine ecosystem, blue carbon, okay? Whether it's San Diego Lagoon and coastal salt marshes, mangrove forests, seagrasses, kelp forests, okay? So we used to save wetlands for their ecosystem services, the fisheries, the birds, right? Water, they're clean, they're places that naturally clean water. And as my friend Ernesto Enkerling, who used to run the National Park Service of Mexico, said, one of Mexico's great conservationists from the northeast of Mexico, helped save bighorn, worked with a group called Per Natura, big charismatic animal conservationist in Mexico, became the national park director. He's like, I don't really care what words we use and frame, we need to save nature, right? we're talking about saving big places, but I can guarantee you that now that we know that our ecosystems and coastal ecosystems absorb carbon, wow, that's one more reason that we need to keep them around and enhance them. So we'll talk about that. Because it has been challenging, as you know, to preserve and restore these places. But what the scientists and people at places like the Tijuana Estuary are telling us is that we're going to have to adapt these places eastward as the sea level rises. And I'll talk about one of the reasons why that's important. There's also green carbon. This is in Oaxaca, a coastal forest that we're working with the community to preserve, an indigenous community through a voluntary agreement. But the green carbon is the carbon in places like the Amazon or our own forests, right? So it's the terrestrial ecosystems. This is in Magdalena Bay where whales go. That's the brown carbon in the air next to the blue carbon, right? And then the whole desert filled with green carbon, right? So really, really important. And what you're seeing around the world is with these big multilateral agreements, this is what's driving international conservation right now. Clearly, the issue of climate change. And the race is on to figure out how we do it quicker and how we really prioritize these ecosystems that are huge sinks for carbon. In fact, the word internationally is, and we use it here, is carbon sink, right? They're carbon sinks. These are places that are to help us address climate change. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Now, is this the same as reducing smokestack emissions across the Midwest in our power plants or figuring out alternatives to the cars stacked up on the 5? Obviously not. Is it one tool in our toolbox to address climate change? Absolutely. Do we now know that what's going to happen when we burn down the Amazon and wildfires start burning in California? Absolutely. It's huge emitters of carbon. And now we're understanding that once we either flood mangroves or coastal wetlands, that huge amounts of carbon are released into the atmosphere as well, which is why, sorry, I don't have COVID, I'm just losing my voice. We now know that the wetland managers know that we've got to adapt these ecosystems eastward in California. So blue carbon and carbon drawn from the atmosphere into plant matter is buried in accumulating sediments and can remain buried for millennia. Carlos, where's Carlos? Carlos, raise your hand. We'll see Carlos in a video. We're working with Audubon in San Diego and getting carbon samples from Formosa Slough that are 1,000 years old, right? Amazing, right? Like really, really cool stuff. Here's how it worked. You can see the carbon dioxide goes down into the soil, it's buried in the mud. So we've really been proving this with soil samples in Mexico, and then at the Center for Climate Change and Adaptation with guys like Mike Costas, who did his PhD on this, and then researchers from Australia and Mexico. So there's been a really interesting convergence of science. People like Octavio Alberto, who then Matt Costa worked with, all kinds of really great scientists. 20 years ago, you didn't hear about this, right? And so it's really in the last 10 years that you've seen there's a lot of great work coming out of Australia. And we've been taking these samples in Mexico and the US, right? The point isn't just to do the science. The point is the science is showing why these places are worthy of protection and also to justify the restoration and to justify not having them bulldozed by bulldozers, right? So here's some of the importance of mangroves. Mangroves were forgotten ecosystems around the world. These are aquatic rainforests, really, really incredible. And let me show you a little video, it's subtitles, but just what our teams have been doing.
Nos encontramos en el estero de un dátil en Baja California Sur.
Dando monitoreos enfocados a carbono. ATUS es aquel, la captura de CO2 y fijación de carbono, la que lo realizan los manglares, las marismas y los pastos marinos.
Un manglar puede absorber y retener hasta 5 veces más dióxido de carbono que un ecosistema forestal, considerando que el dióxido de carbono es uno de los principales gases de efecto invernadero.
Vamos a realizar una serie de actividades para poder muestrear la planta, raíces, subsuelo y poder determinar entonces qué tanto carbono está en stock y almacenado debajo del suelo. Son datos muy importantes para poder proponer la conservación, restauración, incluso el manejo de estos ecosistemas de manglares. Muchas instituciones que están haciendo muchísimos esfuerzos para conservar y restaurar estos ecosistemas.
El daño que le puede hacer la deforestación de estos ecosistemas no va a ser local, sino va a ser global. Los invito a que pongamos nuestro granito de arena. Nos encontramos en el estero de Nati de Baja California.
There we go. So the deal about the superpower of mangroves is, they only occupy 0.2% of the ocean's surface, yet contribute 50% of the total amount of carbon buried in marine sediments. So these are the aquatic superheroes of the planet, right? And a small percentage of them compared to the rainforest and green ecosystems, but fundamentally important for how we address not only the adaptation side, which is key, and the emissions side, right? And one of the things we've been working on in Mexico and started with support from the German government, actually close to 15 years ago. The Germans were giving money for their climate change sort of agreements under the Paris Climate Treaty to Mexico. And the idea was to help on the adaptation piece, help Mexico go out and survey their mangroves. We did over 1,000 miles of surveys with our team in Mexico, boats, quads, you name it. And then the idea was to go under the previous administration, get concessions to there's like an office in Mexico City that you can get concessions or to unassigned federal territory. Sort of like out in the American West when people are bidding on federal land, right? And a guy, instead of doing a ranching permit, he did like a conservation permit or he bought the permit. He got in big trouble for doing that. But we were doing this with the National Park Service, and the idea was to go out and get the 60 feet above, 20 meters above the mean high tide line, and get those deeded back within protected areas to the National Park Service. It turned out a lot of those areas were mangroves as well. This is before we knew that these ecosystems were really sequestering carbon. It was about the adaptation piece. So we managed to preserve huge areas, 8,000 acres of mangroves, but that was along these coastal strips, including 150 miles of coastline within San Ignacio Lagoon, a place that was already protected. But it turns out in Mexican national parks, you can still develop national parks, right? So a really big project we did for adaptation, not the sequestration or not the mitigation. But thanks to the support of the United Nations Environment Program, before the pandemic, we got a grant to work in Laguna San Ignacio. It's about 600 miles south of the US-Mexico border, the last gray whale birthing lagoon where I did my PhD, to work with fishing communities to do a pilot project to start growing mangroves. Because what's happening, there's a guy named Ezekiel Escuro, used to work at San Diego Natural History Museum, he went to UC Riverside. And I remember him talking about this as these very flat areas, and fishermen telling me this, they were seeing more flooding, right? These are the flattest, it's like Western Australia. These are very flat areas. So if you're gonna start looking and documenting sea level rise, this is the place to do it. So these fishermen are seeing these areas that they used to drive through now flooded. What happens when things start flooding? Then you release carbon, right? And so the idea is to figure out how to move these mangroves eastward slowly over time, create more buffers against sea level rise. These are incipient projects. We just started training communities to do this, giving them a wage to do so. On private money, we just got a big grant from the Lauren Jobs, a widow of Stephen Jobs, to work on this as well. Our staff will be down there to get that second phase of that project going. But here's the key, and this is the Blue Jobs piece. We need to figure this out, and we need to train a generation, whether it's in San Diego with the Urban Corps and other youth corps groups, how we're going to reforest the planet, right? How we're going to restore the planet, and what better jobs to create than people to do that. We've been doing that a long time in the United States, but if we don't figure this out in places like Mexico or Brazil or Botswana, we don't have a hope. We have to put our money where our mouth is, and that's what a lot of these multilateral agreements are about, is incentivizing communities to be engaged in the restoration effort, right? And these mangroves sustained the big hurricane hit last year, right? They did sustain that, so that was really, really, really encouraging. We're working on 5 different projects in Mexico with 5 mostly women's groups that are doing this. The men are out fishing and hunting and ranching. what my wife did her PhD on, she saw where the money went, right, in these fishing communities. Women reinvest the money back in the community, in the family. Men sometimes do, but due to issues of alcoholism and all kinds of other things, the money gets, when you work with women, the money goes back into the community, into the family, right? More stability. So it's really important that we're doing that. The Bay of La Paz is one of the largest urban wetlands and mangroves lagoons in Mexico, and we started a restoration program. 155 tons of carbon per acre restored per year, right? A big deal, right? Really big deal. So a lot more than our wetlands you'll see in California. Then we're working in southern Mexico. This is the last Pacific tropical forest and mangrove ecosystems on the Pacific coast. And you've got indigenous communities. You're talking about sending communities for migration. You talk to everybody in Oaxaca, half of them been to San Diego. They all know the Tijuana Estuary. You talk to people in Oaxaca, they've all crossed the Tijuana River. They know it really well. It's really interesting to be in those situations. They go and they've gone back, right? But again, people are making $10 a day, right? So you need to create jobs for communities to help protect ecosystems that they call home. You start looking what's happening in Venezuela, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and the refugees coming up. Those are climate refugees. They're escaping political violence, and they're escaping in Guatemala failing coffee harvests, right? Drought, extended drought. Same thing in Oaxaca. They're on the frontiers of climate change, where the rainy season's coming later, and they're right on the Gulf of Tehuantepec, so you see this interesting green forest and coastal deserts because of the winds that come across the Gulf of Tehuantepec. So this is on the front lines of global conservation, but you can replicate this story everywhere around the world, right? That's the drama. How do you put people to work to save nature? That's it. And that's what the thing is, to save animals, right, Ron? I mean, that's really part of it. How do you create these incentives to do the right thing, right? And how are we going to work with people like this Afro-Mexican community in Chicahua National Park in northern Oaxaca, besieged by the cartels, cartel violence, it's not a safe place to work, right? Who've been isolated in the mangroves, and last week they started building a mangrove nursery. Afro-Mexican women are some of the most isolated communities. That were descendants of slaves who came over with the Spanish. They're still in these coastal areas that they came over with 500 years ago. And so getting them engaged in growing and restoring mangroves, and they're super excited about that. So I've been very, very happy with that, that project. So think about this, 30,459 tons of carbon in 10 to 15 years, so about 3,000 tons a year. So really amazing carbon storage, right? So really, really important stuff. Not a lot of support from the current Mexican administration. This is one of the most antiquated and regressive environmental administrations in modern Mexican history. I did my PhD in Mexican conservation, so I know something about that. We're hoping that Claudia Sheinbaum will probably be the next president of Mexico, who has a PhD in, I think, environmental engineering from Berkeley, and worked on climate change. We're hoping that she'll shift Mexico back into supporting these types of projects. But the reality, we're doubling down on this, and so is most of the international conservation world. And that's really the idea of co-management, where you're working with communities to co-manage these areas. One of the things that's been really important, and we'll talk about carbon credits, we really thought that the carbon market, right, the market, polluters can emit these credits, they can buy these credits, and that they go to fund these types of projects. That hasn't worked out so well. I think a lot of folks have problems with the carbon credits, realize they're not really helping address climate change. We thought, though, that there'd be some place in the carbon market to fund mangrove and wetland restoration. And what we realized is, you can't, these areas, you can't really just grow 10,000 acres of mangroves right away. All of us who've been involved with wetland restoration know that it's excruciatingly challenging work, right? It takes time. And so the mangroves and wetlands aren't growing fast enough. It's not like growing 10,000 acres of pine trees or something, or trees in the rainforest. And so the carbon market's not helping out here. And the carbon projects that have happened to sanction some of the projects in Mexico have been a disaster, repeat on the press. The Mexican government is pushing back on that. the idea is that you're paying people to grow mangroves, and what we were saying was, well, we need to also pay communities to save mangroves. So we had some papers come out, avoided emissions, right? Just talking about avoided emissions by saving mangroves and paying people to help take care of them. So that's part of the drama that we're dealing with. We'll be able to conference in San Francisco. California's got involved with us with the California Air Resources Board because they're trying to honor an MOU that Jerry Brown signed with Mexico to address climate change. But this is challenging stuff, and the argument we're making is with Tanya, who's in that film, is how do you get these credits, or how do you get some of that funding, the multilateral funding, carbon credit funding, into these communities, right? And how do you do it in a way that actually is equitable and fair, that isn't ripping them off, right? World Resources Institute got hammered for doing this in Yucatan, and the Bloomberg News did a whole expose of it, but nobody was bad intentioned. They were reacting to the market. The market credits are low for mangroves and coastal wetlands. That's the challenge, because you can't do enough of them to make them work. But what we've been doing in the meantime, even before the pandemic, we started sponsoring Mexico's and US's first blue carbon forums. We held binational forums in person and then virtually. What was interesting about the virtual forums, we had mangrove residents from all over Mexico talking to scientists from Singapore and Australia. Really amazing stuff, right? We've still been doing it virtually because we want to put the the Colombian scientists and conservationists in touch with California conservationists, right? Like, that dynamic has been really, really interesting. So that's something we'll continue. We had our last binational one last year. Virtually, we want to do them in person, but we can bring a lot more people together on Zoom than we can, getting people on a plane. And right now, we're part of the Global Mangrove Alliance in Mexico. We started the Blue Carbon Collaborative in California that also, we put together these Zoom talks for California, but soon we had people from Washington and Oregon and Mexico in that, right? So it's a really exciting time to be in this field, because I think there really aren't any limits, except how slow things grow, to work on this. And so we'll end with some slides on San Diego, right, and San Diego and Bataquitos. We all know the data, right? California's lost 90% of its coastal wetlands. But the science that Carlos has been doing in the lab, we're seeing that stored carbon is 12 tons of carbon per acre. That's actually pretty good for California habitats. Thanks to also researchers at San Diego State. We had some other numbers that I'll share about the other sequestration rates or carbon storage. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to show Carlos and talking about his blue carbon samples.
Hi, I'm Carlos, the Blue Carbon Conservation Coordinator at WILDCOAST, and today we are out at Bataquitos Lagoon collecting a sediment core to look at the carbon stock of our lagoon. That means how much carbon from plant material and other organisms is buried in the soil.
Now, I'm just taking out a sample at regular intervals.
So, once we have samples from the lagoon, we dry them out, grind them into fine powder, and send them through this process in an elemental analyzer, where we get a percentage of carbon. Using that percentage, we can scale up that information, understand how much is stored in how many acres of salt marsh we're looking at. With organizations like the Bataquitos Lagoon Foundation, the Nature Collective, and the San Diego River Valley Conservancy, and Agua Medina Lagoon Foundation, that we're able to band together to restore these ecosystems and bring the community together to protect some of our remaining coastal treasures.
So some of the science that Carlos and Matt Costas came up with: Brigantine Basin here in San Diego Lagoon, 12 tons an acre. Grasslands in San Diego, thanks to researchers at San Diego State, about 2.5 tons per acre. And then chaparral, coastal sage scrub, 7 tons per acre. So that's actually pretty good. Justified. I love coastal scrub. I was in Laguna Beach yesterday, and you go inland a little bit, and you see the protected areas, are really nice there. So that's really interesting, but highlights why the important work of San Diego River Valley Conservancy and the Nature Collective and others in preserving these wetlands. Audubon, who's now applying this model to Mission Bay, right? Thank God. And the Port of San Diego, who we pitched blue carbon on before the pandemic and have done really, really important research on seagrass, pioneering globally important research on seagrass carbon storage coming out of the Port of San Diego, right? They've completely embraced this concept. We'll have Jason Giffen from the port talking at a panel in a couple of weeks at the Blue Water Film Festival. We're doing a panel on future of our oceans. So this is really interesting, and the port's excited, fired up about growing seagrass in San Diego Bay, right? And so I showed some of these slides in a presentation I did in the fall, but we'll wrap up here just talking about, so what do we need to keep doing? We need to keep doing these restoration projects. We need to use the science to help fuel the restoration and how we do it and where we do it. So we're moving things eastward as sea levels rise. The reality is, I love trees, it's great, but we need cities like Del Mar and Imperial Beach and others that support wetland restoration, carbon storage, need to get credit for that in the Carbon Action Plan. There is no reason why California doesn't do that, and we should. And that's something that we're working on. So that's really important. My buddy Joe Ellis works for Marathon Construction. He's working on that big 600-acre project east of the freeway, the furthest east one. He grew up in IB working on this stuff in the Tijuana estuary. So these are great projects. I mean, they're very, very expensive, but do I get excited going out and seeing big earth movers in San Diego? Absolutely. Was the San Elijo Lagoon project absolutely brilliant? Absolutely. You see the integration of infrastructure development or redoing infrastructure. You have to balance by doing the 5. You have to balance by helping the 1 become better for pedestrians and bicyclists. You have to do the beach stuff, right? The dune restoration. You have to do the restoration in the lagoon. You have to enhance coastal access. Genius. We're doing that in Imperial Beach as well. Getting grants from the California Coast Conservancy and the California Coast Commission. When the state of California focuses on this stuff with the California Coast Conservancy and the Coast Commission, we know how to do this stuff better than anyone. Let me make that clear. Californians and people in San Diego should be proud of the work we've done on this, including Dwight. And these small projects matter as well. We're doing lots of small projects with San Diego and Bataquitos, but every inch counts. And doing the small stuff, especially for the carbon storage projects, helps us learn. Right? There's no downside to this. When it can't fail, we're already failing, right? And I want to just thank the city of Del Mar and Dwight and all the members of the Lagoon Committee, because I think they've really been preaching in the wind. I'm sure it gets a little hard to keep talking about this stuff. I don't think there's any other Lagoon Committee in the state of California that's been as progressive and advanced on this stuff as the city of Del Mar Lagoon Committee. So can we give them a round of applause? Fired up about this stuff. So I think it's really important. So thanks, Dwight, and the rest of the committee for your leadership on this. I talked about carbon markets. We have to work on this. I think the port, we just with the staff of the port, and they kept thinking, the port's going to grow this stuff and get all this revenue, but it's clear to me that's not going to happen. I think the incentives, we have to pay people to help restore nature, but the reality is, I think the climate action planning part is really, really important. And finally, I want to thank all our partners and thank each and one of you, every one of you. Saving nature is a never-ending process, and we're never going to apologize it, and we have to keep doing it and have lots of fun doing it. So thank you very much. I'm not sure. I think I used up all my time, right? So, questions, comments? I'm really hard of hearing, and I lost a hearing aid skiing recently, and I got to get it replaced. So, sorry, too much surfing and polluted water. So.
Does the
I'm sorry?
Does the organization have any interest in the informal assemblages that live on the continental shelf offshore here? Because they are in danger.
Oh, right, yeah. The offshore?
Near shore.
I'm
On the
confused.
continental shelf.
On the continental shelf?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, dragging and oil oil development and all kinds of industrial projects are a big threat to what's under the ocean. So that's a big fight around the world now, what's going on to save the seafloor.
The harmful algal blooms may be causing more damage by orders of magnitude.
Right. That's a good point.
I'd like to talk to you about that.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the blue carbon lagoons for the caps for the coastal cities.
Yeah, so I think this is a challenging piece is, and I said this in IB, we had to do a climate action plan and it drove me crazy. IB needs to grow more trees. That's great. Imperial Beach was built on a salt flat, mud flats, basically a reconstituted wetland. And there's a guy named Greg Abbott who's down in the Tijuana Estuary, who's an expert on native trees in San Diego. So Del Mar, absolutely. Were there a lot of trees in IB? You can look at the old photos of the Tijuana River Line, not really. So did it make sense for IB to go trees? Absolutely, we need more trees. But should IB have gotten credit for working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to restore thousands of acres of wetlands? Absolutely. So that's just a policy piece. Maybe people like Senator Blakespear, and I think Assemblymember Borner Harvath has been working on that as well. So I think that's kind of the policy piece that we got a grant to work on, is try to figure this out in Sacramento. So I think that's really the short end of it, is we've got to really figure this out. In theory, Del Mar supporting wetland restoration should be getting credit for its climate action planning. It's good policy to do that because again, it's an incentive, a political incentive to do the right thing, right? And the focus in California right now, we've been very involved in the Natural Lands Working Group in the state of California. Has really been focused on forestry and forests, right? And we've been trying to get the state of California to acknowledge they finally did blue carbon ecosystems, but I think that's something we just have to continue to work on. Groups like the Nature Conservancy and many others, now our Blue Carbon Collaborative, we're focused on that. Hope that answers your question. It's not rocket science, but we've got to get better at moving quicker on this. Any other questions? Great, thank you.
Interested in supporting any of our work too? We've got a lot of great collateral out here. You can find us online on social media. You can come and talk to any of us. We have our annual fundraiser coming up in June 8th, the Baja Bash. And we have a lot of other community events like this around town. So please sign up for our newsletter or come talk to one of us if you want to get more involved in the great work that WILDCOAST is doing. And thank you all again so much for being here. We really appreciate it.